Hi, this is Paul, and a lot of you will recognize the guy I have with me. His name is Spencer Klavan, and he has written in my opinion, probably the most important book I've read this year. I think that's true. I think this is
Boy,
true.
you did not prepare me for this before we started recording. That's
I think this is the most important new
overwhelmed.
book I've read this year. And I think it is a far better book than Jordan Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God. I love Jordan, but
Okay.
hey, this is we can talk about that because I'm going through We Who Wrestle with God, and I remember going through Maps of Meaning, and it was like, oh, this is just such a tortured book.
Hmm.
Um, this is a beautiful book. This is probably the most beautiful book, best written book I've read this year. It is really, really beautiful, and I can't. We'll get into this. We'll get into this. I've got
Okay.
issues with the title and the cover. I don't think they do the book justice.
Wow. Interesting. Okay, so the title is that you can blame me for the title. You can never really blame the author for the cover, although you can blame me a little bit more for the cover than typical. But I'm very curious to know about both of those. Why you think that is?
I think the title is accurate. I think it's a very accurate title,
Okay.
but I don't think it communicates. Well, it's difficult to communicate what exactly you are communicating in this book, which is not a new thought. Again, Barfield really hammered this hard,
Yes.
but I think you are presenting it in a far better way than Barfield did. It's much. Um, I think I'm very excited about your book. I think
Thank you.
this is
Wow.
a tremendously important book, but it is not because you are attempting a work of exorcism, which is what this book is. You are attempting a work of exorcism. That doesn't, that means that the book has an incredible challenge that it faces
Yeah.
because we are so thoroughly steeped
Yeah.
in, I've called it the scientific lab leak
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
what was good for a laboratory was really important for a laboratory, then it escaped the lab and
Yeah.
suddenly it got applied to everything, which is its downfall.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will start by saying that one of my friends wanted me to call the book Quantum Theology because that he felt would have sold the most copies. Another friend at one of my the people at my publisher wanted to call it the science of God, similarly kind of on the nose. And I probably should have listened to one or the other of those people or come up with something better than that to get across what you've just said, which is that this really is a wholesale attempt to dispel an atmosphere. And it the difficulty of that project is brought to mind by the story of the two fish, the young fish that are swimming along through the water, and the old fish swims by and says, "How's the water, boys?" And one fish turns to the other and says, "What's water?" And you're right. Uh, Exorcism is a beautiful word for it. I've never heard it described that way, but that's what it is. We kind of got swallowed up by our own intellectual project in science when the Newtonian revolution and the kind of dawn of modernity offered these glittering jewels that it did offer of knowledge and power and understanding. They suddenly became our idols. We became obsessed with this way of looking at the world as a kind of machine or object. And whereas that was at one time recognized as a way of looking at the world. In other words, it was one among a number of possible kinds of understanding that you could apply to our much more complex and subtle and varied experience. Um, by this point, the mechanistic, scientistic way of looking at the world no longer counts as an option. It's no longer just one kind of human activity. It is the world. It is reality. It's what we think of as bedrock. And so, of course, it follows that everything else is sort of a footnote or a peripheral derivation of that bedrock. What there is matter, what there is the machine. And then out of that, we derive all kinds of pleasant fictions. There's a wonderful comic called Strange Planet about aliens that are basically us, but they talk funny. And when they tuck their kids into bed, they say, imagine pleasant nonsense, like have, sweet dreams. And what the scientistic fallacy does to us is it leads us to treat all of our humanity as pleasant nonsense. Everything besides what we can measure and count is a sort of fiction that we spin off of reality. And that point of view, that idea was never warranted by science. There was no point in the history of science where that was shown to be true or even argued for expressly as a philosophy. And yet, one of the things I try to do with this book is show, by telling the history of science, show how it was almost natural, almost inevitable that that illusion would start to cloud around us. Um, and one way in which I hope you're right that this book will have significance is that I hope it's one of the last books of its kind that will ever have to be written. You're right that
You're talking to a Protestant minister. Every time we write a sermon, we think this is the last sermon I'll need to write of this kind. And
oh
what
no,
reality
yeah.
shows you that is never the case.
We all thought we put the issue to bed. Well, totally. All right, fair enough. I mean, I guess maybe a less you know, hubristic way of saying that is this book is of a piece with a number of other books. And I actually think that Jordan's book, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't really worked my way through yet. I have it, but I
It
haven't.
requires work,
Oh, I see. Okay.
much more than yours.
I see. I see. I've read a lot of reviews of it, so I have a sense of it. And Jordan is a friend, and I think he's doing really important stuff. Um, and there's another book by David Bentley Hart, All Things Are Full of Gods, that has gotten. If you go on Amazon, I think they'll probably recommend that you buy those three books together, mine and Jordan's and Bentley Hart's. Um, and so it's clearly part of this reawakening that's going
Yes.
on, where
Yes.
we are, for the first time, I think in quite a while, we're at least alive to the possibility that we might be swimming in water. And that's kind of exciting. So the book is an attempt to show people that this is water, that there's such a thing as air, and maybe we might breathe it.
Now, I think those other two titles that were recommended to you might have sold better, but yours is still more accurate to the book. And the I was recently watching I suppose I have to say that you did YouTube demands that I require that you did send this book to me free of charge. I didn't have to pay for it.
Oh,
And
do
I have to say that what that you signed it, that you know the inter I'm deeply moved and honored by that. But I did purchase the audiobook with my own shekels, and I have told many people already that depending, obviously, different people have different ways. I have more time in cars and washing dishes and doing chores than I often have all by myself, where I can have a book in my hand with peace. So I often do a lot of audiobooks. And again, this is another interesting comparison with Jordan's book. Jordan is an amazing dynamic speaker, but I think his book would have been better if he had let someone else read it. But in your case, this was one of, I mean, if this whole writing thing doesn't work out, you can have a lovely career as an audiobook reader. You really can. Not
Right.
only is the book beautifully written,
Hmm.
but you read the book beautifully, and it was a joy to listen to. And me, I listen to a lot of audiobooks,
Uh-huh.
and they are uneven. But this again is way at the top of my list in terms of both a book beautifully written and a
Hmm.
book beautifully read. So, and I say all of this knowing that I am setting myself up for deep frustration
Okay.
because I don't think the book is going to get anywhere near the attention it deserves.
Hmm.
And it because your name isn't big already, it won't sell as well as Jordan's book. And again, I'm not saying anything against Jordan. I love Jordan. And
Right.
anybody who looks at at the amount of videos I've made about Jordan Peterson should be aware of that. But
Yeah.
well, I was recently watching a YouTuber talk to an author about their book, and I was listening to the author, or maybe it was I was reading an author who was complaining about these interviews because the author's complaint was in these interviews, they never really ask me about what's in the book.
Huh.
And we're not going to make that mistake, but the difficulty is that if you could, within 5 or 10 minutes, summarize the book adequately, you wouldn't need to have written the book. And the same goes with any attempt to entitle a book.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna give you that chance, and I'm sure you've had your elevator pitch moments for this, but for the
Sure.
sake of the audience who has not read the book, what is this book about?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same problem as writing a book proposal, right? When you set out to write a book, you have to outline it and offer some chapter by chapter summary. And the thing that every author always wants to say is, look, just read the book. Like that's the whole point. If in fact it were possible, there are books out there that can be summarized in 5 minutes. And
Too
that's,
many, in fact.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. But ChatGPT will soon take over the role of writing those for us, and we can just focus on books that don't have easy summaries. No, I think if I had to say what the book represents or what it is, it's a hard reset on the relationship between science and faith. And it achieves or attempts to perform that hard reset by going back not to the dawn of modern science and the scientific revolution, Galileo and Newton, but actually much further to the Babylonians and the Greeks and to our earliest records of what people are doing when they ask how the world works and what it's made of. And the reason that I do that is both to show that this is not some new anomaly that we've invented called science. This is a continuous, long-standing tradition. And for most of its history, this is in some way or another a religious act. It's a spiritual act, and it's premised on certain spiritual ideas to expect the world to make sense, to expect that the sun will rise in a predictable set of patterns, is in some sense to expect that the world has an order. And at the kind of most extreme version of this premise is that the world has an order which was set in place by a mind, and our minds look like that mind. And if you think about it, actually, you need that maximalist version of it to be confident that science is going to work everywhere and always throughout the universe. Otherwise, we have no reason to expect this tangle of neurons that we happen to have evolved in this corner of the universe is going to be equipped to kind of unpack the far-flung reaches of space. But we do have that expectation, and that's the expectation that underwrites what used to be called natural philosophy, what's now called science. And at a certain point in the history of mankind's intellectual development, those premises fell away from view. They became so successful that they became invisible because we just had taken them for granted for so long that we lost sight of the things that come before science, which are all spiritual things. And what is kind of wonderful, and this is the third and final part of the book, is that although we have been living with the wages of that forgetting, that terrible loss of the spiritual backing of science, we actually kind of ran up against them on the other side. We reached a point as the history of modern science progressed with quantum physics and relativity and many of the developments that we're now tangling with, where those premises of the human mind, the inescapable presence of a mind that observes and knows, um, came back kind of to haunt us, and we couldn't make sense of things without them anymore. And so that's my assessment of where we're at, that we've suddenly been pulled up short in our effort to reduce the world to a machine by the discovery that that was never possible. We never thought we never should have thought that would be possible in the first place. And now there's this giant door standing open before us, and we have to decide, kind of as a civilization, like what we're going to do about that. And my proposal in the book is that if what we're looking for is a way of keeping science as part of our repertoire, loving what it does and what it offers us, and yet not making death-loving crazy people out of ourselves, um, then it's possible the best interpretative technology available to us is actually the Book of Genesis, or something like the ancestral faith that became generated Christianity. And so we're in this moment where, weirdly, the ancient scriptural texts of our wisdom traditions and core religion actually might be the best way to inform what we do with science going forward. And that's the meeting that I think we're kind of on the verge of, that reunion between science and faith.
What can you remember an instance or a time or an occasion when this insight, when you first became aware of this reversing of the assumption of the world? Because I think when we are small, we just absorb these maps of the world, and so the scientific lab leak just, it's like a virus. It gets into us. We begin to think in those terms. It's a powerful thing. All of the highly esteemed around us are sending signals of that. And then at some point, you see something. Well, there's always sort of intimations, and we have that all over the culture of people who are sort of rebelling against that. And sometimes they do it in really, I don't know, really schlocky ways. It's romanticism, it's just fantasy, it's all
Yeah.
kinds of things. But was there you something that happened and you said, "Oh, well, maybe," and that was sort of the edge of the thread that you could sort of follow up on?
Yeah, I think it came really late, which is a testament to what you're saying, that this is not the set of assumptions I'm trying to overturn in this book are really deeply ingrained in us from early on, so that we probably can't remember a time before these assumptions took hold. At least I can't in my life. So it's not like I can say, oh, I really know when this was taught to me, when I was told that physics describes reality and religion describes fantasy or something like that. It's just that I grew up in the heyday of the new atheists. Like when I was in school, those guys were the pinnacle of what it meant to be smart and sophisticated. Christopher Hitchens really was somebody we all, among my set in high school, we thought that guy was the tops. He was it. And so it was just an atmosphere. And I don't think I started actually grappling seriously with that set of assumptions until COVID, which is weird
Really?
because, yeah, I mean, I think that if you had asked me before COVID, I would have said some of the things that ended up in this book. Like, it's not that the pieces weren't there. It's that it was only when the science, capital S, started to really like show its face as a god, really to become an entity in our public life, that I was driven to think seriously about what that word means and what it actually describes. Because you know me, Paul, but not all of your listeners do. Like, I'm a classicist. My background is in ancient Greek literature. It's this stuff is adjacent to my training, but it's not the core of what has fascinated me throughout life. It just forced itself upon me, as I think it has forced itself upon a lot of us, that whatever we're doing, however we're relating to science and technology, it's not sustainable. Um, and so, whereas the politics of COVID were very much about kind of lockdowns and um, vaccines and all the stuff that people were fighting over that I was involved with and interested in and cared about. For me, the ultimate crisis of COVID was actually much more philosophical. It was much more about realizing, oh, wow, we have kind of confronted a god here that we've constructed for ourselves. This is a false god or an idol that we've built. What is it? That's when I started doing the reading and noodling around kind of in a much more directed way. And then the last thing I'll say is that, you mentioned Owen Barfield, and it was definitely Barfield who finally cracked it open for me. And I remember very specifically the place where it happened, and that's the introduction to Saving the Appearances.
Yep.
So I read in grad school Barfield's book Poetic Diction, and it blew my mind. I shared it with my dad and with a few of our close friends, and we all look back on it now as a touchstone of real, like, awakening for us all. But Saving the Appearances is actually a more kind of holistic, like, Poetic Diction takes Barfield's ideas into the place he knew best, which is language. And then Saving the Appearances sort of expands what he discovers in language into the whole world, which is where I think it really belongs. And the opening of that book, he says, we've gone into, in the sciences, we have adopted a kind of doublespeak where when we talk about particle physics, we freely confess that nothing is the same without a conscious observer, that consciousness and observation changes the nature of things in this fundamental way. But in the earth sciences and in geology and in natural history, we talk happily as if none of that stuff were true. And it's perfectly possible to speak of primeval eons elapsing in exactly the same way they would have were there an observer there. And I thought that's a really powerful idea. And that was kind of where I think, I mean, there are several epigraphs in the book from Barfield, and he's obviously a major influence. But it was the 1-2 punch of COVID, and then getting to that Saving the Appearances insight that kind of locked it in for me, I think.
It's interesting because for me, it started with Lewis's book Miracles, is one of his most straightforward apologetics books. I had gotten to a point where I needed to read that book 2 or 3 times a year to keep my faith, to
Mm,
just blunt the this particular worldview, and that was provoked by as a working preacher. This was a number of years before I was grappling with the challenge of presenting the book of Genesis written from a cosmological perspective,
yeah.
where you sort of have this tabletop and then you have a firmament. And I remember having little debates with people about they talk about the waters above and waters below, and I'd ask them where the waters above were, and I'd mention that the sun, the moon, and the stars are beneath the waters above. And they,
Hmm.
because they were saying, no, the waters above are clouds. It's like,
Yeah.
you're
Okay.
fudging. You're
Right.
fudging.
Once
Actually, it was
again.
in college. My wife's, of course, my family was Christian Reformed. My wife's family were fundamentalist Baptist.
Yeah.
And I noticed in my mother-in-law's Bible where she had corrected the Genesis accounts in chapter 1 and 2 in pencil. And I said, now, Mom, you're not really supposed to do that.
Right.
And, but I think, and so I've been, especially with Jordan Peterson. Jordan sort of provoked something in me that
Mm,
started me down a path and onto YouTube and into some of these other conversations.
yeah.
And so I've been watching and I still don't have a description of it that I find adequate, but I'd call it sort of the recession of modernity. Not that modernity is going away, but its grip is sort of like an ice age. The ice is pulling back and, leaving glaciers and glaciation in its recess. But
Mm.
I think you're right in that COVID, I think, provoked so many, many more people to, when we were told to so overtly trust the science,
Yeah.
and then the science was so obviously untrustworthy that the God science suddenly took a really big hit in many people's perception.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a tripwire, right? It's not that COVID obviously and instantly overturned centuries of bad assumptions about science. It's just that those assumptions had been like stewing under the surface of most people's direct awareness for a very, very long time until suddenly they generated an outcome that was so obviously intolerable that people were willing again to reconsider the assumptions themselves. I think of this as the bankruptcy effect. It's like how did you go bankrupt very slowly and then all at once? That's what this is. It's like, there's certain things that are just going on. I mean, there's probably another one heading our way in the form of the national debt, right? It's like this, we all sit around, we talk about how it's really bad. It's sure really bad, but our lives basically go on uninterrupted. And then suddenly something really comes, some hammer comes down, and you are finally willing in the days of that pain to reconsider. And it's not great that that's what it requires. You wouldn't wish that suffering on anybody, but you see it happening in the Bible. I mean, the Babylonian exile is the prime example of this. And I think Lewis in Screwtape Letters has the devil say something like, every now and then a war or a catastrophe causes, for he allows it to cause a sudden reawakening of the moral sensibility. And there's definitely that element. COVID had that effect on me, and I think a lot of other people. And an interesting point about Lewis's miracles. Um, it's funny that that was really central for you. That's the book that sent me to Barfield for the first time because there's
Oh,
that wonderful passage in it where he basically explains all of Barfield.
yes.
If you indicated Barfield is not, Lewis was this wonderful prose stylist and certainly the man after whom I try most to fashion myself. I mean, he is my intellectual hero for exactly the reason that he has this iceberg of like classical learning floating underneath this wonderfully lucid prose. And he had that great gift, which Barfield did not, whatever the opposite of that gift is, Barfield had it. I mean, he had the sort of ability to make even simple subjects sort of opaque. And and so Lewis very self-effacingly refers to poetic diction and says, if you really want to know this stuff, you have to read poetic diction, and then goes on in the most beautiful and intelligible terms to explain the entire premise of poetic diction with the story of the young girl who thought that there were little red angry dots inside of her body or something because she had a
Horrid
virus.
red things and the
Horrid red thing.
poison.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I found that passage wonderful, and it leads into a discussion, I think, of the ascension. He's talking about some of the
Yep.
miracles in the Gospels
Yep.
and the kind of facile modern objection that people don't float up into the sky. Lewis is saying, in fact, in the Hellenistic era, the people that observed these miracles would have been perfectly capable of kind of inferring from them that their senses had encountered something that sort of transcends the normal structure of time and space, but that is not necessarily doesn't necessarily correspond to Jesus now living on Saturn or whatever thing it is that would be implied by a normal ascension. And so yeah, that book is a marvelous way of thinking about the supernatural, and it then sent me to Barfield, who I think is kind of the next step in this chain, is thinking about how language and even picture thinking um, we're always kind of addicted to it. We're always falling prey to our own words and images and taking those images to be reality rather than maps or signs of reality. It's just that scientism is a particularly pervasive and all-encompassing version of that problem, I think.
Now, the part of the book actually I most enjoyed was the first third,
Okay.
which was your retelling
Mm,
of the history of science. And to me, I found that to be so engaging and so helpful
mm,
as I am not a scientist. I I almost had a math major in college.
okay.
I eventually mathematics got too theoretical, and then it wasn't really as much fun and clear. And I saw some people in my class who were savants, and they were just getting it like this, and I was struggling. So then I hopped over to history because I
Yep.
found that much more fun. And,
Yep.
and as a minister, history was also more helpful. But your I was that actually the history of science portion of the book was probably also the one I was most surprised at, knowing that you're a classicist.
Yeah.
So my question is both, how did you get up to speed on that? Because I would imagine you had to do a ton of learning to write
Yes.
that portion of the book, and also because the academy is what it is, how much grief have you gotten for that section of the book? Because, of course, it's a history of science. And so there's two vulnerabilities there. People will attack you on the science. And, of course, historiography is a real thing. And so,
Yep.
but for me, that was the rest of the book. I saw very clearly as a classicist would offer it. But the
Mm.
history of science portion, I enjoyed the most. So tell me about the development of that part of the book.
Yeah, it's the part I had the most fun writing, and it's because, as you say, I'm most out of my element in it. There's for me, this is not like my readers have no obligation to enjoy this with me, but for me, it's where I'm having the most fun is when I'm being challenged and stretched into new areas of knowledge. There was a huge learning curve. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm like you in that I did have a kind of math heavy trajectory before I veered off into classics, but I very much did veer. So I'm by no means up to speed on. I'm not going to be the guy that solves quantum gravity, right? Like that's not my role in life. And I think I say that at the beginning of the book that this is a book that's probably going to drive both theologians and scientists up the wall because it's somebody intruding at every page almost. I'm intruding on two different territories that really aren't mine. Um, and I will say this that in the same way that we are living through, as you say, the recession of modernity and the emergence of something new in its wake, I also think we are living through a new age of the generalist, which is what the Renaissance was an age of the generalist. And I think that we are also desperately in need of synthesis. So I had a little bit of confidence that came from that I've always really, my best work, my most effective stuff has always been based on taking the stuff I know best and kind of templating it onto other areas of knowledge. And of course, the Greeks were the masters at this of taking this one theory, like the theory of the soul, and then kind of blowing it up into a theory of the city and blowing it up into a theory of history. And I feel that one of the things actually scientism has done to us is kind of imprison us in very narrow domains of authority and expertise so that we feel incompetent to say with certainty anything outside of what we have the most data about. And that's not to say that you can just go spouting off about anything, but it is to say that I feel that at this point, there are certain areas where an outsider view is really, really helpful. And this is one of them. Because one of the effects that impressed itself upon me again and again as I was reading about the history of science was that the more people become disconnected from scripture and theology, and the more religion is kind of exiled from the realm of appropriate scientific inquiry, the more unaware scientists become, of the ways in which the things they're saying are profoundly theological, are just echoing, ringing with these theological resonances. And it's like walking into a house where there's no lights on. Like you get to this point where Niels Bohr is saying like, well, if there was an original singularity, then it would require some sort of prime observer, somebody. It's like, if only we had somebody like that, Niels. Like, what are you crazy? But of course, like they've been trained out of thinking, in that way. And in fact, Einstein was very, very anxious about not letting theology back into science. Um, and so for me, there's always it's important to remember that you're not going to uncover some new, that there are other people who are trained to uncover scientific fact, and that's not my job. It's not what I'm here to do. But at the same time, I actually feel it's urgently important for people to make that leap across disciplines, um, so that we can see again the ways in which these things are all connected. I mean, the last person probably who was able to see things that way was like a Goethe or a Coleridge right before the sciences became so big in our lives. Um, and that's kind of, I think, why I felt entitled to do this, is I think it's a big part of what we need at the moment.
It strikes me that while I think you're exactly right that sort of a modernism forced a siloing, it sort of forced a social coercive siloing. None of us can actually get away with that. In order to actually live in this world, you're going to have to develop your own syntheses. And I think
Yeah.
part of the reason why we are in the age of the generalist is because of social media, some of what we're doing is we're all sort of forced or at least enabled to share our syntheses with
Hmm.
others. And there is a market for that because people, again, Lewis in his book Miracles, in a sense, did the same thing. Lewis was
Yeah.
not a theologian, which he would remind people of all the time. And he was not a scientist. And in fact, math was one of his weaker subjects.
Hmm.
Um, what Lewis did share with us were his syntheses, often, again, in beautiful prose and also in story.
Yeah.
And people have found that helpful because in order to live in the world, you must engage multiple silos. And whether good or bad, you're going to have to come up with some hash of whatever they're doing out there in order to make progress. And again, I think also COVID was a moment of that when suddenly, and I think this is part of where Jordan Peterson has been so helpful,
Yeah.
at some point when you have to act, your synthesis will be engaged because it is from your synthesis that you have to base your action. Do I get the jab? Do I not get the jab? What do I say to my doctor? What do I say to my family? Do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? Am I going to isolate? I mean, COVID just presented people with a matrix of decisions they had to make.
Right.
Whereas before, okay, so you go to church and you have all these random thoughts, and it's like, well, I'm not gonna tell the other people in church, my doubts or qualms about this or that because I don't have to. I can just sort of put on the suit and sing the songs and go in and out, and I'll leave my private doubts to myself. And I think
Yeah.
also, let's say, perhaps analogous to COVID, in terms of what happened in the culture with respect to the church, you had this. I've been lately making videos about the movement from the seeker movement to the emergent church movement, which I think facilitated a massive deconstruction and de-churching of people,
Hmm.
which then I think also prompted a lot more generalists saying, well, now I sort of have to cough up my synthesis. And whereas I can't be expected to have all of my footnotes in order. I
Yeah.
can't be expected to get all the math and science right.
Yeah.
What we are doing is constantly evaluating each other and rank ordering each other to say, he might not have his science right. And in fact, on certain things of politics, religion, and technology, he might be completely wrong, but there's a light to that person's life
Mm,
that is attractive to me, and I'm going to follow it to a degree in order to maybe gain something of what he has. And so I think you're right that I think part of the reason for the age of the generalist is the rise of social media, where lived examples of synthesis are now
yep.
before us in a way that they weren't when we sort of had the more narrowed bottleneck.
Wow. That's really interesting. And I think your point is very important that we're already synthesizing all the time. We're always already synthesizing, whether we know it or not. And if we don't know it, the only thing that's going to do is end us up with really bad syntheses. And usually the form that that has taken, in my lifetime at least, has been theology and philosophy masquerading as a kind of scientific discovery. And so you have all these popularizers, Carl Sagan, Feynman, although he was a great scientist, was also known for doing this a little bit. Bill Nye, the science guy. I mean, all of these guys who have the imprimatur somewhere of the hard sciences, drawing out of them lessons that are in no way necessitated by the hard sciences about what we should do with the environment, about how we should treat one another, about how we should regard our place in the universe. You are star stuff, right? I mean, these are statements that came with a straight face out of the mouth of somebody claiming to speak for the hard sciences. But of course, it was a theology and remains a theology. And in the book, there are all sorts of examples of, I think it's really in the 1800s that this starts to take shape and you really see it kind of crystallizing at that moment. And uh, because it comes with a certain aura of science, because it is derived from or like riffing on scientific fact, those kinds of syntheses, those grand unified field theories of the world have a currency in our modern uh, public sphere that theology and religion have lost and or had lost at the time. They're kind of starting to gain it back again because scientific theology has really failed. It has really left people very bereft and confused and in many cases miserable. And so people are starting to say, well, maybe actually these aren't very good total maps of the world. And this is certainly helpful. This is good, right? Because in fact, they're not deriving your grand theory of human life out of the hard sciences is just a bad model. It's just not a helpful thing to do because in fact, the hard sciences are subordinate to the larger questions that theology and religion answers. On the other side, I think the theologians have some blame to bear here because when science started to become openly hostile to to religion and theology, I think religious people acted with either fear or anger or some mixture of both. And the anger version is something like you don't need to touch that stuff. In fact, it's dangerous. Don't even get into questions about fossil records. Your faith is precious and will be undermined and threatened by questioning kind of my version of the Genesis account. The fear version is that people just totally gave up on natural theology, which used to be one of the central domains. Is like, look at how God's creation speaks of his majesty. See how we can look at the natural world and we can learn things about its creator that way. And scientists, or rather theologians, just felt completely incapable of doing that. And so totally surrendered that territory to the Carl Sagans and the Feynmans of the world. Um, and again, this is why like you're going to have a theology operative in your life. Um, and if it's not coming from some sort of theological thinker, it's going to come from somebody that feels entitled to take scientific or neurological data and spin it out into a myth about the origins of the cosmos. Um, and so now we're at this place where everybody is realizing there's a need for spirituality. Um, but the one obvious source of spirituality has been kind of discredited and tapped out. And so it feels a little bit like, okay, we've all just suddenly realized that there's this thing called Saturn, this planet up in the sky. And the obvious natural thing for us to do would be to consult a science textbook and be like, well, what is Saturn? You know, when does it appear in the sky? And what have people kind of figured out about that over the years? And we would go to a physics textbook naturally. In the spiritual domain, we're like, wow, there's a soul. Wow, there's maybe some sort of creative mind. The obvious thing to do is to look at the Bible, right? Like the Bible is a physics textbook in spirituality, but it has been so discredited that I think we instead turn to like whatever that the version of astrology is that we happen to prefer. And this is very much still going, like this part of it I think is still very much in process. You look at, like, I've become a little bit fixated on Brian Johnson lately, the guy that thinks he's never going to die if he just
Oh,
stayed indoors. I don't know if you're familiar with this
no,
guy.
I'm not.
Oh boy. I'm both delighted and so sorry that I get to introduce you to this fellow. His mantra is "Don't die," and this is a guy who is doing, you know, minutely calibrating his every action so that he never encounters, and he has, you know, all these metrics like his I forget what it's called exactly, but his actual age is not the same as his like measured age
Oh yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
younger than he's really supposed to be. But so this is one among innumerable examples, I think, of those kind of rival alternatives for synthesis that are currently on offer. And that part of it is very much still live. And I think a big part of the work that people like you and I are doing is like trying to figure out how to steer people towards something better.
Have you done much engagement with John Vervaeke's work?
You know, it's kind of a lacuna. No, I haven't, but I should.
Because this, we really have to get your book into John's hands because John will be all over this. One of the books, my last conversation with John that he recommended to me was The Blind Spot,
Hmm.
which is a book, and there's a lot of parallels between that book's written by scientists, and they don't have anywhere near the the civilization exorcist ambition that your book has in their book, but it's it's there in terms of they are trying to, from the posture of scientists, tell people that we're scientists. And so we sort of naturally have a leg up on us, but that's not really deserved because you don't really know what science is. You've bought a god, and science isn't really a god. And so
Yeah.
it's a great book, but I mean, your book fits very well into what John Vervaeke talks about in terms of he's got objective and subjective. He says fundamentally reality is transjective. It's
Mm.
fundamentally relational. And so as I went through your book, how many conversations I've had with John Vervaeke and how much engagement with his work, it really fits hand in glove. Except again, because John is coming at this from a non-theistic point of view. John's history with Christianity is pretty complex, and because he's spent a fair of his amount of his life in Taoism and Buddhism, a lot of Christians sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to it that they won't have to your book.
Interesting.
So, but I think maybe after this I'll send an email between you and John, and because I think in many ways your mission with this book and John's overall project really fits nicely together.
I would love that, first of all. It's actually been just in the back of my mind that Vervaeke's an important guy that I sort of need to be much more engaged with his work, and I'd love to get in touch with him. And the ecumenism point that you sort of evoked there is a really important dimension of this. And maybe we should spend some time like exploring it a little because
I call
I
it metagelical. because
Meta.
ecumenism is sort of the World Council of Churches and all that
Yeah.
mainline stuff. This
Yeah.
is this is this is sort of a movement where the evangelicals sort of dissolved the boundaries between Protestants, and now we're seeing them dissolved much further out. So
Mm. Okay.
keep going. I'm sorry.
Oh, fascinating. And that's a great term. Much like transjective, a term I also love.
Exactly.
Metagelical is really, really good and has the advantage of sounding a bit like a hair product. Which um,
I won't live and die on the word, but I think what I'm trying to point to with the word is
yeah,
is really what's happening right now.
100%. And I raise it because often I've been asked about my book, how Christian do you have to be to accept the argument that you're putting forward here? And the answer is kind of like you can get 90% of the way I want to go without accepting uniquely Christian assumptions. Many of the assumptions I'm arguing for here are Christian, but they are not proprietary Christian ideas. In fact, I would say the core theological concepts you have to be willing to entertain in my book is the imago Dei, the image of God in man, and that is famously part of the Jewish kind of gift to the world, right? It's in Genesis, so it is very much already part of at least two religions. Um, there's some stuff in there about Jesus and what I think the incarnation represents, um, that kind of rounds the point of view out that I'm trying to present. So it is a Christian book in that sense, but it's also true that the problems I'm trying to alert people to and deal with are much like they're way prior to Christianity or any particular form of Christianity. Like they're much more first principle level questions. And on those questions, like once you're at the part of the pyramid that is below the kind of Christian point, once you're in these kind of more basic foundational things, um, there are kind of enormous resources, some of which I'm conversant in, some of which I'm not, from a variety of other traditions. I mean, I mentioned that book, All Things Are Full of Gods, which I just read, in part because it's always getting mentioned kind of alongside my book. But one of the things that interested me about it was that it has a kind of through line of I guess Indian philosophy is what you would call it. It's not quite Hinduism. It's much more about ancient Indian philosophy of consciousness. Um, and that's because, as David Bentley Hart suggests, argues, he feels that this is a strain of thought that has dealt very subtly with some of the problems of consciousness that we are just now coming to be aware of. So I am really sort of I don't have any like table pounding sort of statements to make about this. I'm much more in a kind of question mark or interested kind of phase here because I'm so often, you mentioned Jordan Peterson, like I'm so often confronted with people who are like, why won't Jordan Peterson just bite the bullet and become a Christian, right? Like, why can't he like see that he's and my feeling is like, well, actually, it's possible that a lot of people like Jordan are in sort of a more amorphous space and haven't even like gotten around yet to thinking about the perpetual virginity of Mary or whatever else, like whatever other Nicene Creed points you're sort of worried about.
Perpetual, it's not in the Nicene Creed. I just want to be sure clear about
Oh, I'm
that.
sorry. No, no, no. Yeah, yeah. Those are two separate things. Okay. Thank you for rescuing me. And in no way do I mean to imply that those two things are identical, but rather that the Nicene Creed also contains a number of
That's
very
right.
specific theological points,
Right.
which, unlike the perpetual virginity of Mary, I'm ready, lock, stock, and barrel to sign up. But, you know, I'm actually not right now concerned with really arguing that everybody should believe the points of the Nicene Creed because I just think there's a lot of homework we have to do before we even get there. And at that point, you are dealing with like stuff that the Greek philosophers dealt with, stuff that apparently I'm learning, is in some of the ancient Indian philosophy. Certainly Taoism is like a major. I actually am a big Tao Te Ching fan. I'm an amateur fan, but I think there's a lot in there as well that's kind of relevant to some of this stuff. Um, and that part of it can be finicky and touchy to deal with, as you probably know better than anybody, because the minute you start to say some of these things, you don't need Christianity to get to some of these first points, you sound like you're saying you don't need Christianity or Christianity isn't true. And that's not the point. The point is that there are some things that Christianity explicitly takes for granted that are now at issue and in question and need arguing.
It's, it occurs to me that before the modernist fundamentalist feud that really takes off in the 19th century,
Mm.
especially in America and to a degree in Britain, it's mostly in the Anglo world, the English speaking world, there was a much broader acceptance of Christianity as something that integrated the classical, the pre-Christian classical world into it and subsumed it. And I
Hmm.
think now we're getting a little bit more of that through Peugeot and the growth of orthodoxy in the West that
Yeah.
has always had that sort of baked into it. But I
Mm.
think part of the problem happened with the modernist fundamentalist feud, then sort of, it really sets science and religion at odds. And it also provokes sort of a posture with respect to the classical world and even the medieval world, because the modernist fundamentalist is often a Protestant feud
Hmm.
that sort of sets this up. And again, with the recession of modernity, we're also seeing the modernist fundamentalist feud sort of recede as well, because I regularly find now Protestant authors and evangelical authors doing much more appreciative grappling with theology of the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas, church fathers. And so again, we were sort of set up to um, to have certain biases against science if you were part of certain kinds of churches. And I think while these things move very slowly, overall we're beginning to see a new opening where people will and again, I think that was my favorite part of your book. And I think for many readers, that new telling of the history of science with this particular aspect in mind, people will find that extremely helpful
Mm.
because, you know, maybe, just maybe, you got a wisp of the fact that Newton was fundamentally motivated by his spirituality,
Right.
which
Right.
then gives you an idea of why. And then when people say, well, he wrote a lot more about theology than he did about physics, people hear that and they're like, what? And then you
Yeah.
mentioned the alchemy, and people
Yeah.
really don't know what to think.
Right.
But I think
Well,
again, your telling of this history sort of helps take a lot of these things that would strike modernists as, well, there's an anomaly I'm just simply going to throw away and just have my little imaginative construct of Newton in this little box so I can maintain Newtonian mechanics until whatever Einstein did, which I'll never bother understanding. So I think again, that part of the book has done a great service.
oh, thank you. And I mean, it is certainly, uh, I mean, I think we all got handed a series of morality tales, starting with Galileo and progressing through Newton, about the triumph of enlightenment against the regressive forces of theology. I mean, you could almost write this. I could still write this story in my sleep, even though I don't believe it anymore, right? That this was Galileo got told by the big bad Catholic Church that he couldn't say those nasty things about the sun that he was saying, and this was very sad. But good news in the end, like religion lost and science won, and that is sort of the implied or explicit message of a lot of high school history teaching about
Yep.
science, insofar as you get the history of science. And it is funny, actually, that you get so much science now in school and so little history of science. I mean, you
Yes.
usually get it as a kind of footnote to the science that you're getting. And I think another intervention that I hope my book will make is to kind of correct that balance for people, so that you see these ideas like gravitation as products of a whole way of looking at things. And I agree with you that the intra-Christian wars, disputes, which really prevailed and were urgent in generations before ours, have started very much to kind of fade into the background as the signal conflict turns out to be scientism versus some kind of spirituality. And part of it is just, I think that when you're culturally dominant, when Christianity as a whole is culturally dominant, you can devote more time and resources to adjudicating the differences within it. Whereas when Christianity is threatened or feels like it's receding, then people want to close ranks and argue for spirituality as a whole, Christianity as a whole, etc. Um, but part of it also, and this is something I argue in the book, is I really feel that Christ, Christian fundamentalism of the stripe that we usually mean when we use that term, really is a product of the scientific revolution. It is not actually a ancient kind of ancestral inheritance, but is a reaction to this nuclear blast of scientism. And that's really important also to see in its historical context, because you realize that if you're fighting for, you know, the Bible's description of the age of the earth being chronologically exact, it's not that you can't have interesting arguments and conversations about that. It's that if that's what your Christianity hinges on, then you've already given the game away before it starts, because you've already accepted, before even having the conversation, accepted the premise that what it would mean for the Bible to be true in every particular is that it would be geologically and physically accurate in measurable and quantifiable ways at every point in its text. And I just think that that is not a fight. That's a losing battle, not because the fundamentalists are always wrong about every point, but because it already is taking place within a field that is defined for us by modernity. And so now we're kind of moving outside of that, I feel. Uh, and part of it is like stepping back and realizing, oh, we're not, the battle of our times is not actually Protestant Catholic or this kind of Protestant versus that kind of Protestant. It's the faith of our ancestors versus this perversion of natural science that has like swallowed up the world.
There's one thing that I want to mention in your book that really helped. Actually, it was your whole book that really helped me, because as a preacher, I regularly, obviously, deal with the Sermon on the Mount. And
Hmm.
in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus very clearly, well, it might not be very clear if you're reading certain English translations,
Hmm.
but Jesus very clearly articulates an emanation theory of sight.
Oh yeah, right, right.
And so, and for years, okay, I'm preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, I'm going through, and then you hit that passage, and it's like, now what do I do with this? Because, I am, and this again is one of these instances where I'm so steeped in the in the materialist worldview, even though I'm sort of in portions of myself trying to break out of it and resisting it. And you come across this verse where Jesus is very clearly articulating, and then I read in my commentaries, well, this is one theory about, the emanation, theory of sight, and here Jesus uses that. But then suddenly I have to sort of then start Christological issues come up, and I mean all sorts of issues come up, and it's like, and then I've got to present this in the context of a sermon where the vast majority of people are just trying to maybe, but they don't even. know what synthesis they're working on in order to make sense of life, and they're just looking for some little tidbit that will help them in some way, maybe somehow, Pastor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this book sort of just kind of takes that and says, and I think this is the, this is where the, your title is at, and it's sort of the main thesis of the book is that seeing is not what you think it is.
Totally. Well, it's funny you were asking earlier about the origins of this book in my personal history, like where did I start thinking about this stuff? And that part of the book is the oldest part of the book in
Hmm.
my journey. I actually at in grad school I ran a little, it wasn't a church, a home church exactly, but it was like a weekly meeting to talk about a Bible passage, and we worked through various different books of the Bible. Um, and it was exactly in arriving at that passage and being like, oh wait, what do we think about, like what did Jesus think about extramission and intramission? And did he just kind of take the common whatever? So I went on this whole rabbit hole into Al-Haytham, who shows up in the book, and all these the history of the science of optics, which is a relatively late kind of development
Yes.
among the basic facts of science, like the discovery that light comes into the eyes definitively is as a relatively late discovery, precisely for this reason that even though it is true that physical light enters our physical eyes, we all know that we sense that we do something to the stuff that comes in, that we don't just have what Henry James, or rather William James, called a blooming, buzzing confusion. It's sort of filtered through our consciousness. Um, and maybe, who knows, there was a time when we were infants when the world was much more kind of just a barrage of sense impressions. But at all the points that we can remember, the world is organized, and light that comes into our eyes is also shaped almost involuntarily into form and into color and all of these things that don't have any real existence except as perceived. Um, and in fact, if you think your way into a state of mind that is pre modern science, and that is not obsessed with nailing down, you know, the geometric kind of dimensions of the material world, but is actually trying to describe in a more holistic way what's going on. And then you read a text like Plato's Timaeus, which is way earlier than the Gospels, but where we find a very clear sort of description of this extramission theory, the idea that fire comes out of the eyes. And if you think, well, okay, so maybe Plato's actually not trying to do the same thing that like a modern optician is trying to do. Maybe he's trying to describe in his classic sort of metaphorical, mythological language what sight is. And if you read it that way, it's actually an extremely profound text. It says basically that the gods created the world imbued with fire, that there's fire all throughout the air, and that our eyes have what Timaeus calls a twin flame within them, that there's something analogous, or there's some kind of answering twin in us, in our mind, that is out there in the world. And when these two things meet, that is the mode of perception that we call sight, Timaeus says. And taken as a physical statement, that is false. And so when it became the case that only physical statements could be true, people decided, well, Plato was totally wrong about sight. But it's very possible that Plato had no intention of presenting it as a physical theory of what sight is, or if he did, it was only because he was interested in how that physical mechanism sort of embodied a much more profound spiritual inner invisible truth, which is that when the world meets our perception and our consciousness, there's a kind of union between two things that are similar to one another but different. They're similar in form but different in identity. And then you get this like explosion. And that's still true. I mean, even if you now kind of translate all this into neurology and you say, well, photons hit our rods and cones and the brain performs something, 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 like a series of operations that is still completely opaque, even to our best neurologists, but like transforms those geometric motions into what we call sight. We're still basically saying that the light of the eyes meets the light of the world. We're just not saying it in the same kind of physicalized terms that Plato was talking about. So what does this all mean for the Sermon on the Mount? Well, I mean, I actually have no idea what Jesus thought about like photons. I genuinely, I don't think he deigned to inform us, you know, and and I feel like he didn't stutter. So if he didn't think it was important to inform us, then I guess it's not really important for me to know. Um, it's possible that it's possible for me to conceive that in the limitations of his humanity, like while he consented to be embodied and live a human life, that included limitations on his material knowledge, such that he basically believed what everybody around him believed about light. It's also possible if I imagine myself into that for a second, it matters to me not at all because what he's saying in that passage is take this image, like think of your eye as a lamp illuminating the whole body. And now understand that if that light goes dark, everything within you and outside of you goes dark. That like your mode of perception transforms the world. And that is still 110% true, whether or not Jesus thought he was using a real description of light, or whether like God had given him a preview of Newtonian optics. Like also totally possible to me. But it sort of like sidesteps the whole question, which I think is kind of helpful because that's not really the question that we want. We don't want to be tangled up in that question when we're coming to the Gospels. We want, as you say, to get some kind of insight into how we can live fully. Um, and usually, I think the obsession that we have with physicalist accuracy is like a bit of a red herring, distracting from that.
Well, and I think McGilchrist is super helpful with that. That there's a part of us really wants that emissarian accounting. But
Hmm.
the deeper question is, which I think you really get at towards the end of the book, why do we want that emissarian accounting? And the why is because and I think you really nailed it well in the book is that and this goes all the way back to Genesis. The why is because we really hope that God can be done away with
Yeah.
so that we will mount his throne, so that we will I mean there's a motivational problem that we have. And even, just as for us to get at, okay, so what did Plato want? Well, in some sense, he probably wanted the same thing that we all want,
Right. Right.
but none of us are very clear on exactly what that is. I mean, clearly there's part of us that wants mastery and domination, and we're these tiny egoists that really want to have everything at the expense of we don't care. Um,
Yeah.
and so then yeah, that no, I think you again this is why again I think your book is so important and so well done. And I am already emotionally prepared for my frustration that it won't get the kind of credit or visibility your book deserves because I really think it is that good and that important. And one of the reasons is, and I want to ask you a little bit about because so you and I did this event in Washington D.C. a couple summers ago, which was a
Yep.
wonderful event, and that was a chance for me to actually get to know you a little bit more. And one of the things that you talked about was your discipline of poetry memorizing,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
which I think is clearly fruitful because again, your book is beautifully written, and so but my question more is also when I was going through the portion about, especially the portion about the history of science, which is something that I'm probably going to listen to two or three times just because I think it is so well done and so important that I want to get it into my head more deeply. But one of the things that, so I, as a preacher, I have to try to fit something of the Bible into a somewhere between 25 and 40 minutes. Ideally, some preachers try to keep it within 20, but I'm a little more evangelical, so I'll go to
I was going
45.
to say, yeah, this is like for an Anglican, you're really
I
that's
know.
the problem. That sounds like luxurious, but yes, go
Exactly.
on.
But the perpetual challenge of pacing and selection, Vervaeke would say relevance realization. In order to tell a story well, you need to have, you need to figure out the container, and you already know way more than what can fit into it. So obviously there's a matter of selection, and then of course there's all the writing stuff. So when you mentioned already that this section on the Sermon on the Mount was the oldest portion of the book.
Yeah.
Again, and again, sorry, Jordan. I was going to mention that actually what you just mentioned in terms of the Sermon on the Mount and this kind of theory about seeing, this was exactly Jordan Peterson's first on stage debate with Sam Harris in
Wow.
Vancouver, because Jordan kept wanting to have Sam see that Sam's whole theory of engagement with the world
Yeah.
is actually archaic and out of date. And Jordan tried to keep just Sam, play with me a little bit. And I likened it to two toddlers sharing a rug and some blocks, and Jordan would keep building something and
Yeah.
inviting Sam to play, and all Sam wanted to do was kick it down. And the
Right.
whole 2 hours was just that. But
Yeah.
anyway, tell me a little bit how you went about constructing this book, because again, I think part of the beauty of this book was its pacing. And somewhere I heard that, again, sorry, Jordan, We Who Wrestle with God, which I know is a super important book for Jordan.
Uh-huh.
Somewhere I heard something like it was first like 1,500 pages,
Okay.
and they made him cut it down, which was good. But this book, I think, again, in terms of what this book needs to do and the audience it can reach, I think it's the right length. I think the selection of materials is excellent. I mean, a lot of that goes into what does it take to write a really good book? And I think you really nailed it. So, talk to me a little bit about your process of selection. I also see that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I see the world as having two kinds of writers. There are vomiters and there are
Huh.
nigglers. I'm a vomiter, which is why YouTube works better for me, because every time I look at whatever I vomit, it's like, oh, it's crap, and I re-vomit again.
Yeah.
I really struggle with niggling. Some of
Yeah.
my friends, they just get something down and they niggle and niggle and niggle and calibrate, and then finally they have it. So
Uh,
so
yeah.
which are you, and how did you deal with this question of selection and pacing for this book?
Wow. Well, I mean, you're being so generous that I feel like I have to stop at every point and tell you, like, thank you very much, because that is, I mean, it's music to my ears, truly, and I really appreciate it, and obviously I respect your work and your opinions enormously. So viewers and listeners are hearing me blush in real time because this is all sort of new to me. Um, I will say it's funny. I think this is part of what people like about podcasts and YouTube is that it's not constrained in quite the same way as writing is. And I it's also why I love doing YouTube interviews and podcasts of my own is because when I started my podcast, the very first thing people said to me was, "Oh, ramble more, like talk more." And I was thinking, "Oh, I am, as you say, I am a niggler. I am a tinkerer, a cutter. I was trained on the 800 word op-ed, right? That was where I like sharpened my literary sensibilities. And so I thought, yes, I'm going to get your podcast in 30 minutes. I'm going to really hone in exactly. It was like, absolutely not. Like digress. I mean, I guess Trump was on Rogan. He called it the weave, like go here and there, kind of come back around as long as you remember what you're talking about in the end. Um, and that is not my way of writing at all. It is my way of speaking. I think it works much better in podcasting, and that's what you get out of podcasting is like all the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor.
Yep.
Um, but yes, I am very much a ruthless outliner, selector. and the metaphor that always comes up for me is craftsman. I have a little workshop and I have my tools and I am chiseling out, today maybe I'm sort of rough cutting the whole chair, but tomorrow I'm going to be carefully chiseling the detail on one leg. And then, and I have a diagram or a blueprint of how the whole thing's going to look. Um, and really all of that is just because I believe very firmly that intellectual work should be beautiful. And I came to this belief in grad school where nobody agreed with me about it, where the whole point was
That's a
that
damning statement about grad
I mean,
school.
listen, I love academics so much. I am one. I believe in academia. It fills me with sorrow, actually, that academia has come in for so much merited fire because it is a crown jewel of the West and that we produced these universities and that they serve a really important social function that can't be replicated by the market, that requires patronage, that needs like real support. And the fact that all of that social trust has been squandered in like a generation is an actual sorrow to me. So I say all of this advisedly, but one of the things that academics tend to think is that language is a kind of unshapely, inconvenient box into which they are forced to put their brilliant ideas so that they can send them to your doorstep. I get this a lot as an editor. I receive submissions and I'm like, this is a person who has no respect for the English language, except as like the vehicle he's forced to use for whatever genius thought. And my feeling, inspired again by C.S. Lewis to some extent, is that actually that's not what language is at all. And the process of writing and composing is the process of thought in some essential fundamental way. And even more importantly, it's attractive to the soul. Like a reader who opens a beautifully written book is being told something more than the sentences say. Like the sentences in this book say things which presumably could have been written a bunch of other ways, but I'm communicating something with the effort to make it beautiful, which is that this is beautiful. This thing that I'm describing, even the mistakes, even the story of how we went wrong has a poetry to it and a loveliness. Um, and I just think that's actually kind of important and it's part of the work that I'm here to do. Like other people have other jobs, including the job of going away and doing archival research and coming out with it in just whatever messy format they want to give it to you. And that's important. And I've read a lot of that kind of stuff in preparation for writing this book. But I do think that like my part of my role is to make it beautiful. Um, and so and that is a process that requires just a lot of like time, for me at least, requires a lot of time and chiseling, um, and darling murdering and all the stuff that they talk about in literature class, right? You got to cut stuff ruthlessly. You got to keep a document. I mean, my Substack is basically just like all the stuff that I cut out of the book, and you do all of that, and you're always, the other part of it, if there are people listening that want to write and want advice, like uh, one thing I will say is you just have to read so much more than you think you have to read.
Mm.
Like, um, and you have to read well-written stuff, even if it has nothing to do with what you're working on. So right now, I'm reading a book, an American history, which is very important, and I need to read. It's also a big clunky mess, and I can feel as I'm reading it, that voice is getting in my head. And so this weekend I was like, I just have to, I opened Nancy Mitford's The Pursuit of Love, a novel I've never read, but just a sort of sparkling 20th century English romance novel. Because I was like, I just need something, some other voice in my head, because it's dangerous otherwise. It's like bad for me, even though I have to be reading this other book. So yeah, I'm very much a craftsman, like, and I think that that's kind of part of the job that I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to get across.
I I suspected so, but I thought as I was going through, especially the history of science, because history, especially history in the post printing press era, history is so difficult because There's so much of it.
Yeah.
And so selection is so vital if you want the story to work. And again, I thought what you did with it was just really, really good.
Thank you.
Now I've got one more I've got one more idea for you, and then we'll see where it goes. As one of the biggest challenges I think that many Christians face in believing the Bible, if they've in any way engaged with, let's say, the dominant materialist um, story of cosmology, is the question of the fall.
Mm. Yeah.
Because while people have a motivated reason to deny original sin, which I can understand, the question that somehow human rebellion has corrupted, I don't know if corrupt's quite the right word, but human rebellion has impacted. I usually phrase it in that the original hierarchy of creation is God, human viceroy, natural world. And when we rebelled against God, the natural world rebelled against us, and we're set as enemies to each other. And you can read about that pretty clearly in something like Romans 8.
Mm.
Now, part of what happens in an evolutionary materialist cosmology is that even if you admit to something such as the rebellion of our first parents corrupted the children, forevermore until something and someone can address that corruption, you still have the problem that what does it mean that death comes into the world through the curse of Adam? Because Adam is quite clearly, the day you eat this, you will die. And even as a kid, I read that story and I was like, wait a minute. Adam lives how many centuries? And what does
Yeah.
that do with this? And so there's all these little mysteries in there that really that they really sort of get highlighted in the modern period, again, because of sort of this assumed implicit way of thinking that the years mean what we think of the years and all of this stuff.
Right.
And I regularly, and one of the things I've thought about a lot is okay, so rebellion of humanity, if you just think of human beings as one animal among many, who eventually, let's say, grow up, and then you finally have this terrible vision that I think you articulate well at the end of the book, that it's sort of the telos of the materialist world where history would be better without human beings.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if in I think I think the correction that your book offers in terms of the worldview through which we understand consciousness, perception, and the world, if in fact it might not begin to put us on a path where we can better understand what the Bible and what pre-modern um, theologians understood about what exactly is our fall and how, in fact, does that corrupt and set up the kind of antagonism against nature that we currently live in today.
Uh,
And it was just an inkling I got from your book that, oh, this could be helpful into understanding sort of the avalanche from the garden to the field,
mm.
whereby now, let's say before, prelapsarian Adam and Eve lived in a certain harmony with nature, that now the tooth and claw that nature is red with is pointed against us. And of course, C.S. Lewis, in my favorite book of his, which is Miracles, when
Mm.
he deals with the miracles, he has miracles of the new creation where he begins to engage with that. And Lewis again, part of the reason I liked that book from Lewis is because he began to give me an inkling into, okay, how might the resurrection reset our relationship with sister nature? So, and
Hmm.
I thought what you're getting at this book, I thought, oh, this might really be productive into coming to terms with some very dramatic, some very dramatic implications that Christian history, Christian theology has long had with respect to the fall that sort of get twisted and unbelievable in our own world, in our modernist worldview. So I don't know if that's something you've been thinking about or if that's a totally new idea.
No, I'm very glad to have a chance to kind of puzzle this out with you because the flip side of not writing a 400-page book, but instead chiseling it into a neat little package is that every book you write that way generates about five other potential next books, which is nice if you want to keep writing for your whole life. But it does mean that there are these things that right now, as I'm thinking about what comes next, yeah, are I think latent in the place where Light of the Mind ends up, and this is very much one of them. Um, it to me, I'll say kind of where it's been leading me, and maybe you can respond, and because I think it's similar to some of the thoughts that it raised with you. Um, to me, it all hinges on that offer: "You shall become as gods, knowing good and evil."
Yep.
And I think that before writing this book, I had always placed the emphasis in that sentence on gods, good and evil. You shall become as gods, knowing good and evil, these things that previously you didn't know. And now I wonder whether the key word in that offer isn't knowing, it's the verb. It's what kind of relationship we're supposed to stand in to good and evil.
Hmm.
Um, because knowing is a very specific kind of relationship, and
Yes.
it's not the only kind of relationship that's possible in life. I mean, especially intellectual knowledge of the kind that we're most familiar with, um, describes a very specific kind of mastery. And so it might not be that the serpent suddenly brought good and evil into Adam and Eve's life, which has never quite made any sense to me because of course there was certainly good in the garden. So didn't they have some relationship with that? And it seems to me that the answer is obviously yes. But maybe what the serpent is offering them is the ability to know good and evil. That is not to embody them or live them or be in communion with good, to seek good, to love good. I mean, these are all verbs that you could apply to good and evil, especially love, right? We love good, we hate evil. Um, but instead, you could know them, which implies a certain remove and
Hmm.
detachment and control. That now you are going to be stepping outside of creation to evaluate it on your own terms and make decisions about what counts as good and what counts as evil, and maybe even rewrite those decisions at will. And then it starts to sound a lot more like what I recognize as our problem. I mean, if I look around at the world, you know, the problems that I see don't have to do with the fact that good and evil are in the world, because actually it seems like that's part of the creation is that there's a moral order. The problem is more about our sort of desire to take the joystick out of God's hands. And I mean, what does it say in Isaiah, right? Woe to those who call good evil and evil good. Like we want to have some kind of um, like willful control over good and evil, over the world, over what counts as good and evil, which implies that like we are not subject to it. We're not kind of naturally drawn toward it. We are in control of it, and we're treating it like this external object. Um, and that is a transformation of our relationship to the world. It cuts us off in some sense from everything that is spiritual in creation. Um, and perhaps the prelapsarian state is one of simply loving good. That is, being in this kind of direct communion with every part of creation that speaks of God, right? God has made this thing that is kind of a giant self-portrait, and then he places a little mini me inside of it to like love that self-portrait, and that like simplicity and directness of love is kind of the original creation. And then I think we sort of we muck that up somehow by like trying to kind of get control over it, by like by stepping back out of it to try and get control over it. Um, and so once that's done, it kind of can't be undone. And it is something that like I can't will myself out of that condition. Like I can't just wake up today and decide, no, I'm actually going to naturally love everything that's good for me and desire what is right and love just like I just can't I don't wake up in the morning with that option. And so whatever the new creation is, it must be like God interposing himself somehow um, so that I can, or so that I can make my way back into that state. Um, and I think the genius of salvation, if I could put it that way, is that it creates the possibility of something we can choose to love. That is a human being, right? We can actually direct our will. There was no good direction for us to point our free will until God interposed himself or something like that. And that, yeah, that is all about our state of mind. It might be that the creation the material creation, if I can even speak of such a thing, is exactly the same raw material that it was when we were first, when Adam and Eve were first made. But our relationship to it has been so profoundly altered that we can't kind of get back to that without putting on some new state of being or something.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
Part of part of part of what I part of what I oh years ago reading Paul, um I came up with this little saying, the age of decay, and I really annoyed my congregation with it because I've got a congregation of older people who are very much knowing the age of decay because they're watching their bodies age. And I remember one woman is like, stop talking about that darn age of decay. I don't need to hear about it. I live it every day.
Right.
Um, and one of the things that, the Greeks were, part of, and you're the classicist, you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but, the Greeks had this, the Greeks, of course, had, very much looked into the ideal because, as Lewis, of course, said, every instance of love in this world will end due to death or betrayal. But love itself, so this Platonic ideal that is in the heavenlies, apart from decay. Of course, in some ways, Jesus. I don't know if you've ever read any Dallas Willard.
No, no.
Dallas Willard was a phenomenologist who taught at USC. He led the Renovare movement, which was sort of a movement, a very early, I would say, metagelical movement that introduced to a bunch of um, evangelical Protestants historical Christian practice, ascetic practices, and monastic practice. He wrote one of his best books, The Divine Conspiracy, is a treatment of the Sermon on the Mount, and he makes the argument that Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount is engaging Plato, which I thought was a really remarkable argument because I had always sort of had Plato and Jesus in two separate worlds. And
Yeah,
then when I read Dallas Willard, he's like, no, 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 no.
yeah,
You've got to understand where moth and rust, down here where moth and rust consume, and in heaven where they don't consume. And that, between Lewis and Dallas Willard, they sort of rearranged my view with respect to the age of decay.
Mhm.
And so part of what, part of what happens, yeah, I don't know. And so then when I think about the new creation, and when Paul writes about the new creation in Romans, for example, in Romans 8, part of the flesh, Jesus comes out of the grave and let's say creation 2.0,
Hmm.
flesh not subject to decay. Of course, spiritual flesh, as Paul describes it. And of course, there's plenty to talk about with respect to that. But um, it just this whole drama of subject to frustration, which again Paul writes about in Romans 8,
Yeah.
and the new creation. So yeah, again, I your book just gave me an inkling, and it just happened. I was just thinking about this morning that I haven't had
Yeah.
much time to develop it. That I'm thinking, I wonder, given the fact that in many ways what your book did for me was helps continue the process of of continuing to rework my map of ontology.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so this insight that you flesh out in the book, I think hopefully helps me understand a little bit better what the resurrection means,
Yeah.
what the new creation means. And again, for me, because I'm not an academic, I'm a pastor, and most of the time I'm sort of embedded in normal people's imaginations
Right.
when I have to tell stories about, okay, what I remember a good friend of mine who was dying. He was oh gosh, he was such a fun guy. He was a lover of, he had a degree in anthropology from Berkeley,
Hmm.
but he was also an alcoholic and he destroyed his life on the bottle and then found AA and just, AA is a little secret. AA is populated with a bunch of addicts. And their addicted, their addictive personality
Right.
continues even after they achieve sobriety.
Uh,
Um, and so he was the buyer for Tower Music in its heyday of classical and opera.
cool.
And
Yeah.
when he died, he left his poor widow with 12,000 records and about as many tapes and CDs in their house.
Right.
So it was a significant problem for her.
Uh,
But he was just a lover of life, and he tried to make a living selling insurance, but every time he and I would have these long conversations on the phone, and
yeah.
whenever someone would call for business, he would like hang up on them because I'm having more fun talking to my pastor than I am going to sell. So of course he was poor,
Right.
terrible insurance salesman. But when he was dying, he was so frustrated because he didn't want to leave this world because he loved to eat and he
Hmm.
loved music and he
Hmm.
loved life.
Yeah.
And so I kept trying, as his pastor, I kept trying to say, Neil, what is happening now is not a cutting off
Right.
of music and life and food and riches. Neil, you've been in the shadowlands, you've been in the foothills. What you are entering into will be far better than what you and I have had to share in this world. And I couldn't exercise that damn spirit from
Hmm.
his imagination to give him the kind of consolation
Yeah.
that the gospel is designed to deliver to those who believe. And so I was so frustrated as a pastor that, well, I guess it doesn't really matter because now he sees what I've been trying to tell him. But at least in those few moments at his death, I couldn't, he was so full of angst and sorrow. And I was there with him as he was dying. And I'm like, Neil, listen to me.
Hmm.
Don't, there's biology involved in dying too, that of course contributes to our emotional states, et cetera, et cetera. But, and again, I thought there was enough, you were helping me enough with the redemption of my worldview that
Hmm.
I think, maybe this is going to help us have better dreams about the age to come sufficient to encourage Christians
Hmm.
not to fear death in the way that they do, but to
Mm.
say, I can actually live more generously and sacrificially in this life because what Jesus says about, storing, heaping up my heaps in heaven rather
Yeah.
than in the age of decay. And then maybe your insight into the ontology of the world can help me believe Jesus better.
Hmm. Well, if that were true, then I would have done everything I hoped to set out to do with this book. You know, you mentioned very generously that it should get more recognition than perhaps it will, but I personally have always felt that books are actually, I mean, it's great, of course, to sell books, and I've been lucky even in the extent that I have been able to sell books, and fame is nice, recognition is nice. Um, but that's not really why we write books, and that's not actually why books endure. Some of the greatest books ever written were totally unnoticed in their time, and um, really, uh, if we're not about making Jesus real to one another, um, then we're not about anything in the end. Like everything else is going to pass away, right? Um, and I do feel that so far the people who have written to me about this book, you know, who have said like this made it easier somehow. It took away some barrier. You know, there are versions of different versions of this that I've heard, but that it you know that it took away a barrier to um, feeling like this could be real. And I think that's like everything that echoes into eternity. Um, and I do think, yeah, it's got to do with this relationship we have to the natural world that we've chosen, or somebody but long before us chose to think about it as an object, which of course eventually means that we ourselves become objects to one another. And in fact, we are in this intense communion, which, right, is only hinted at by the pleasures of the flesh. There, if anything, the pleasures of the flesh are too um, pale and diluted for what we're supposed to learn to love and have. Like, there's not that we're going to be giving up our bodies to get some floating ghost-like emanation and enjoy pure, you know, chaste purity for all eternity. It's that we are going to become so much more immediately and intensely embodied, that our communion will be face to face. I just like as you are talking and thinking about this passage from Paradise Lost, um, that I was working with just this morning as part of something I'm now putting together. Um, where Raphael, the angel, describes to Adam what it's like for angels to commune. Um, and because they don't have fleshly bodies, they have a kind of friendship and a kind of love, and it's even suggested perhaps a kind of sex that is total. That is, they just mingle the essence of themselves with one another. And he says, easier than air with air, if spirits embrace, total they mix, union of pure with pure, desiring, nor restrained conveyance need, as flesh to mix with flesh, or soul with soul. Um, and the way that we are like all craving, I think, to know and be known is obviously that. And right now we do it through a glass darkly in this oblique way, that science, I think, or scientism has only encouraged us to kind of um, to accept that as a substitute for what we really crave, which is soul to soul communion. And I think that's what we're working back toward in the grand arc of history, is to know as we are known.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good place probably to end.
Sure.
Um, because that's where and I actually do think that despite all of the apologetics and things that Christian ministers and the Christian community is doing, I think if we could give a clearer, more compelling, embodied vision of the life of the age to come that would and does far outstrip any of these arguments that we give people to believe, because human beings, they when they see the good, the true, and the beautiful, they pursue it.
Hmm.
And so anyway, anything you wanted to ask me, or anything you want to promote, or I know we
Oh,
don't have a lot of
boy.
time left.
No, thank you for this. This was a really great conversation. I guess if people are interested, I was interested that you liked the audiobook, and I think I want to commend that to people. This is a listenable book. I know that's a popular way of experiencing it. So it's on Audible. But I think if people want to sign up for my Substack, which is called rejoiceevermore.substack.com, that's the easiest way to get just direct news from me and all the stuff I'm up to. But no, this has been a delight. Thank you for having me on. And
Wow.
I hope we do it again.
Yeah, I'm really glad that, I saw on Twitter that, oh, he wrote a book, and your book had been mentioned again with Dreer's book and Douthit's new book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm really quite excited about the little things that I've heard about it. And then you sent it to me, and then I started it, and then of course I got the audiobook because I'm always doing stuff. And but then it grabbed me. I thought, oh, this is really good. This is really a good book. And so I'm very excited to recommend it to people. And I really do hope that more and more people get a chance to read it. And yeah, but books are funny things. They go out in the world and you never quite know what they're going to do or not do. So
That's right. Well, it's at that point, as with all things out of our control, it's up to God.
that's right. That's right. Well, I will end the recording here, Spencer, but thank you for taking the time and for sharing your book with me.
Thank you. It was a delight.